You're the president of the Heritage Foundation, one of the authors of that document, The Pride of Lafayette, Louisiana. It's great to see you. Welcome back.
It's kind of you to say that and kind of have me back.
By all means. So I'm curious to hear a lot of stuff from you today. Number one, how you're dealing with the fire hose, the shock and awe here. Is this what you foresaw? And to the extent that you're kind of squinting your eyes, looking at the campaign and looking at the new administration, the document that you crafted has quite a bit in common with what we have seen over the past couple of weeks, hasn't it?
I look at this as a historian. I was educated as an early American historian, and I'm hard-pressed to think of another American president who has started with this pace. It really is, from a conservative policy point of view, to your question, Joe, shock and awe. To be clear, President Trump and Vice President Vance deserve 100% of the credit. It is those two men and the great men and women they've assembled, I think what will be the greatest cabinet in modern American history, who deserve all that credit. I think the conservative movement, to your question, understood that we needed to be much better prepared in serving this president than we were the last time. And to the extent that any of us, whether it's us at Heritage or a million other conservatives, had some tiny role in suggesting a menu of options, that's fine. We've done that at Heritage for 45 years. We'll do it for the next 145. But Trump and Vance deserve credit for this moment.
Has anything, though, that we've seen take place in the last 2 weeks and change not aligned with that point of view, with the American leadership picture that was outlined in those 900-something pages?
The real thrust of the work that we do at Heritage, as you know, is to articulate an aspirational vision for revitalizing self-governance, restoring freedom to the American people, as President Trump said in his inaugural, a revolution of common sense. And there is no exception to the fact that everything that he has done up to this point is going to do all of those things. Heritage stands ready, not just to help with these executive actions from the outside, obviously, but very importantly, considering another aspect of our work, and as you've been covering in your show, making sure that our legislative leaders pass the necessary attendant legislation to amplify the successful executive orders that have happened up to this point.
Well, connecting the dots there is going to be an interesting challenge, and I'd love to hear more from you on that. But it sounds like you're happy with what we're seeing from Elon Musk, this individual who has been thrown in the middle of this whole thing. A lot of people in the first Trump administration and now the second said they voted for Donald Trump because they wanted somebody to come to Washington to break it. I don't know if that kind of creative destruction or whatever you call that sounds like the right answer to you, but is Elon Musk, is the richest man in the world, the guy to do it?
Creative destruction is precisely what Washington needed, and we are celebrating at Heritage the first phases of the unearthing of the grift and corruption that has happened in this city that, of course, is bipartisan, but a bipartisan problem, but also is something that for all of us who want transparency, regardless of our politics, it's a good thing that happens. And I think that in addition to the creativity that Donald Trump himself brings to the office, the innovation the vice president brings to the office, that having someone with the success of Elon Musk to be a partner in this is really good. And I find it sort of comical, not suggesting that you were saying this, Joe, that all of the chatter, say, from House and Senate Democrats about Elon being unelected never was observed about George Soros or Alex Soros. And they, of course, with their creative destruction, have actually destroyed American institutions. The Trump-Vance revolution that's 2 weeks in is actually restoring those.
Except that there is congressional constitutional roles in things like appropriations that it does seem Elon Musk might be stepping on in his blanket, say, push to unauthorized USAID, get rid of the agency or move the agency, which is something that usually would take a congressional act. Do you not see lapses with what is in keeping with the U.S. Constitution and what is happening here?
No, I don't see lapses. In fact, I see the opposite. I see that what Musk and Trump and Vance are doing is correcting what have been lapses by the radical left, actually worse than lapses, I dare say, intentional desires to totally ignore the Constitution by creating a fourth branch of government, the administrative state, that sees as itself more important than any president of the United States. And all of this is a corrective to that. But to the heart of your question, there also has to be a legislative season. And that legislative season is going to be much more successful if the House and Senate, as we heard from on your show from one important figure here, Jason Smith, gets going on the substance. At Heritage, we're agnostic about the number of bills it takes to get this done, but the sooner they can deliver on closing the southern border, on ending the ridiculous overregulation of the American economy, on extending the Trump tax cuts, I think the more that we will see these dots being connected.
How about cutting spending in that reconciliation plan? We had heard a Freedom Caucus that wants $2 to $3 trillion to emerge out of this bill. Steve Scalise came out of a meeting last night saying it's $1 trillion. Are you about to be disappointed on this number with a Republican majority of 1 in the House?
I think that it's a very difficult mathematic problem in two ways, as you know. Not just the budget itself, but also the math in the House. And Speaker Johnson and Leader Scalise have their work cut out for them. Having said that, the most important math problem that the American people have is that as the government continues to spend more money than it possesses under both Republican and Democrat administrations, the American people with their own dollars are able to afford less and less. That's the number that that Heritage and all of us are focused on there. We understand that it might take a couple of bites at the apple in order to get this done. The first bite at the apple needs to be the most aggressive so that we can actually change that overspending trajectory.
Russ Vought, who, of course, you know quite well, tomorrow night is expected to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be the new OMB director. And given what already has taken place at the OMB in the last week and changed the lawsuits that have followed from confusing messaging around a funding freeze, are you worried that he's inheriting a bit of a problem right when he steps into the job around that ongoing lawsuit, around the needing to navigate with Elon Musk and the Doge as well? What is he walking into?
Great question. I know Russ Vought very well. He's one of the great statesmen of our age, and I've never seen any problem, any dilemma that Russ is not up to the task for. Having said that, I think what he's walking into is a tremendous opportunity to correct the over-regulation, the overspending, particularly of the last 4 years, but also of the last several administrations. And not only is Russ up to that task, but I think as I would argue members of both political parties in Congress see Russ and his team in action, they will see that all they're doing is delivering on the will of the people with a sophistication and intellect that probably has not been in that office until the last time Russ was OMB director.
Has he been talking with Elon Musk? I wouldn't want to have to fit in the same room as Elon Musk. We've already seen an executive order stopping federal grants, federal aid. People at USAID have been put on leave. If you're running OMB, don't you need to have some say in this?
I assume that they're talking about that. There's no doubt in my mind that Russ will have say in that. That's all the more reason that he be confirmed as quickly as possible.
I want to ask you about something else that took place at the White House yesterday, which was a meeting between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and a joint news conference that followed in which the president suggested that the U.S. take over Gaza, that the Palestinians currently there be moved, and essentially the U.S. and U.S. troops help lead what would be a redevelopment project. And I do wonder what your view is on U.S. involvement in the Middle East in that kind of way, when we heard the president on the campaign trail repeatedly saying he doesn't want to see forever wars.
Contrast what Trump said yesterday and what have been related actions by his administration with the utter incompetence and fecklessness of the previous administration. I say that not as a partisan, which I'm not, but as a historian of American politics. And the contrast could not be more beneficial for free people on the planet, all free people on the planet.
Palestinians included?
Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing from Trump with this comment yesterday about Gaza is the reinsertion of the American presidency and of America generally as having moral clarity in that region and around the world. We trust fully the details that President Trump will come up with regarding what we do with the Gaza Strip, with the Middle East generally. And I think over time, passing days, passing weeks, as more and more people across the world enjoy peace because of Trump's moral clarity, we will understand that that kind of courage is precisely what's been lacking over the last 4 years.
We only have about a minute left, Kevin. You must shudder at the thought of what it would cost, however, for the U.S. to take over the Gaza Strip, clean it out, rebuild the entire thing. If we're at a moment now where we're trying to enter a period of austerity, how do you have both?
Yeah, I shudder at the $250 billion that we've spent on Ukraine for a war that the Ukrainians could never win.
Ready to spend
while we
more
were
on
being
this?
lied to by the deep state in Washington, D.C., which is probably financially compromised.
That means less to go around now, though, doesn't it?
That's exactly right. And that's why I say, if you think about comments that National Security Advisor Mike Waltz said today, they're going to get the details on that right. Mm-hmm. If you look at Trump's track record regarding foreign policy and America's leadership in the world, it is robust, but it's also not expensive.